All right, welcome in everyone to a deep dive. It's a case that's really stranger than fiction, I think.
Yeah.
The Ezra McCandless case, and we're pulling this from an episode of the Anatomy of Murder podcast.
Right.
Um, this case is really interesting because it's kind of like a puzzle box.
Yeah.
There are all these layers of relationships and evidence and all the legal arguments,
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of our mission today to unpack all of that.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this is just the initial setup.
Yeah.
We're in this peaceful rural community in Dunn County, Wisconsin. This is back in March 2018.
Okay.
And suddenly this 20-year-old artist named Ezra McCandless appears injured at a local farmer's doorstep,
Yeah.
claiming to be a victim of this really brutal attack.
So right away, there's this mystery, We've got a potential victim, Ezra, but at the same time, she's pointing the finger at her ex-boyfriend, Alex Woodworth, as the attacker.
Right. And as investigators start to try to piece together what happened leading up to this, they discover that Ezra was involved in not just one, but two romantic relationships.
Oh, wow.
So it's this love triangle that becomes really important and involves Alex and another man named Jason Mingo.
So I've got this really tangled web of relationships already.
Yeah.
Is it possible that jealousy or possessiveness, played a role in what happened here?
It's definitely possible.
Okay.
I mean, we do see some patterns of some pretty intense emotions and potential manipulation within these relationships. Ezra had previously accused another man of sexual assault.
Okay.
But that case was later dismissed because of evidence that was actually presented by Alex
Wow.
that contradicted her claims.
That's a significant detail. It makes you wonder about the dynamics between Ezra and all these men in her life.
Yeah.
I mean, was she truly a victim, or was there something else going on?
Yeah, that was a question that investigators were grappling with for
Yeah.
sure. And the situation becomes even more complicated when they find Ezra's car.
Oh.
It's stuck in this muddy field,
Okay.
and tragically, Alex's body is found inside.
So this is where things really shift.
Absolutely.
It goes from an assault case to a homicide investigation.
Exactly. The details of the crime scene are also pretty disturbing.
Okay.
Alex had been stabbed 16 times.
Oh, my gosh.
There was a scarf around his neck and even a puncture wound on his head.
16 stab wounds. That's a lot of violence. It really makes you question if this could have been self-defense like Ezra was initially claiming.
Right, you're right. Studies show that in genuine self-defense cases, the attacks typically stop when the threat is neutralized.
Okay.
But the sheer number and placement of these wounds, including, ones to the back of the head, the neck, and the groin, suggest a level of aggression that goes beyond just protecting yourself.
Yeah, it seems like the evidence was starting to tell a very different story than what Ezra was saying. For example, there was blood spatter found outside the car,
Right.
which contradicts her claim that the entire struggle happened inside the vehicle.
Yeah, that blood spatter evidence is really crucial
Okay.
because it can tell a story independently of any witness statements.
Right.
Analysts look at the size, the shape, and the distribution of bloodstains to try to figure out what happened.
Yeah.
And in this case, the spatter patterns outside the car really suggested that there was a struggle that happened outside the vehicle,
Okay.
which obviously, contradicts what Ezra had said.
So we have this physical evidence that doesn't line up with Ezra's account.
Yeah.
And then there are also the injuries that she claimed Alex inflicted on her.
Right.
She had the word boy carved into her arm and some cuts on her legs. And she was saying that Alex had done this to her.
Yeah, but investigators were really suspicious about the nature and placement of these injuries.
Really?
Yeah.
How so?
So forensic experts can analyze the way that, letters are carved, and they can look for things like hesitation marks, the depth of the cuts, and whether the angles are consistent with someone doing it to themselves. And in this case, the evidence suggested that Ezra, who was right-handed, likely carved that word on her own arm.
Wow.
And the cuts on her legs also looked kind of consistent with being self-inflicted.
So even Ezra's own injuries become a major point of contention in the investigation.
Exactly.
And didn't she eventually admit to carving the word belie on her arm herself?
She did, but she gave kind of a strange explanation for it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she claimed that she did it to help her remember what happened,
Oh, wow.
which of course, strained credibility.
Yeah.
And if she was willing to alter evidence in one way, it just kind of cast doubt over her entire story
Right.
about what happened that night.
Absolutely. Now, hours before Alex's body was discovered, there was this really tense encounter between Ezra, Alex, and Jason.
Yeah.
What happened during that meeting?
So Jason was suspicious of Ezra's behavior,
Okay.
and he decided to bike over to Alex's house. And when he got there, he found Ezra and Alex together. And he could sense that something just wasn't right.
Oh, wow.
So he actually called the police.
He did?
Yeah.
So what happened then?
Well, when the police arrived, both Ezra and Alex downplayed the situation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they said they were just having a conversation and that they were about to head to a more public place.
And that seemingly harmless statement, like, takes on a whole new meaning, now knowing what happened later.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, did Ezra intentionally lure Alex to that secluded field with the intention of harming him?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
It definitely adds another layer to this already very complicated puzzle.
We have conflicting accounts, suspicious injuries, a web of relationships that are full of tension and possible manipulation.
Yeah.
What do you think? How does it all connect?
Well, it seems like the evidence is pointing towards something more calculated than just a spontaneous act of self-defense. The inconsistencies in Ezra's story, the forensic evidence at the crime scene, and her attempts to manipulate the evidence all suggest that there's just more to this case than meets the eye.
This is where the legal proceedings get really interesting, because now we have this mountain of evidence, we have conflicting testimonies, and this really complex web of relationships.
Right.
So how does all of this play out in court?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in the next part of this deep dive.
Okay.
We'll really get into how the prosecution built their case, the defense's arguments, and ultimately how the jury reached their verdict in this really captivating and really tragic case.
So we've laid the groundwork today. We've looked at the initial events, the key players, and all the evidence that started to unravel Ezra's story.
Right.
But there's still a lot more to uncover.
Yes.
So stay tuned as we delve into that legal battle and the search for justice in the Ezra McCandless case.
I know, sounds good. You know, as we move into like the legal proceedings, you'll see how this case kind of became a media sensation.
Really?
Yeah. Ezra's gender identity journey became a focal point for a lot of outlets, which unfortunately sometimes overshadowed the real core issues of the trial.
It's interesting how certain details can just grab the public's attention sometimes.
Right.
And sometimes at the expense of a more comprehensive understanding of the case. Do you think that this media attention had any impact on the trial itself?
It's hard to say for sure, but, you know, it's just important to remember that legal proceedings should really focus on the facts and the evidence and not on sensationalized narratives.
Absolutely. So let's get into the prosecution's strategy.
Okay.
What were their main arguments against Ezra's self-defense claim?
So the prosecution really meticulously chipped away at Ezra's story, highlighting inconsistencies and pointing out things that just didn't really line up with a typical self-defense case. They presented evidence that challenged her account of the struggle, the nature of her injuries, and even her behavior after the incident.
You mentioned earlier that the number of stab wounds was a red flag.
Right.
How did the prosecution use that detail to build their case?
So they argued that 16 stab wounds, including the ones to really vulnerable areas like the neck and groin, indicated a level of rage and aggression that went way beyond what's usually considered reasonable force in self-defense. They brought in experts who testified that the force that was used was excessive and inconsistent with someone who was just trying to protect themselves from an immediate threat.
So they were really trying to poke holes in the foundation of her defense.
Exactly.
Did they have any specific evidence that this was premeditated?
Yes. One piece of evidence that was pretty damaging was Alex's coat.
His coat.
Yeah, so Ezra had claimed that he was wearing it during the whole attack. But the stab wounds that were on the left side of his body didn't actually match up with the coat.
Really?
Yeah. Some wounds had gone through his sweater, but didn't have corresponding punctures on the jacket.
That seems like a pretty significant contradiction.
Yeah.
What did the defense say about that?
They argued that the coat might have shifted during the struggle, but the prosecution countered that by demonstrating that, like, the placement and the angle of the wounds made that very unlikely.
So those misaligned stab wounds really became a key piece of evidence, suggesting that her account of the struggle was made up. This case seems to really hinge on the interpretation of the evidence. And, you know, whose story is more believable? What about Ezra's demeanor during the trial? Did that play a role in how the jury perceived her?
You know, it's important to note that courtroom behavior can definitely influence a jury's impression of a defendant. And in this case, observers noted that Ezra seemed more focused on Jason,
Okay.
who was actually present in the courtroom,
Interesting.
than on defending herself
Wow.
against these very serious charges.
That's really interesting. She even tried to bring BDSM into the story, didn't she?
She did.
Yeah.
Saying that the knife play might have been consensual.
Right.
That's kind of a left turn. How did the prosecution respond to that?
Well, they basically said that it was a desperate attempt to kind of deflect attention from the evidence against her.
Okay.
They said there was no prior history or indication of BDSM in their relationship, and that this claim was just a tactic to create doubt in the minds of the jurors.
Okay, so the prosecution's saying that she was intentionally misleading the court.
Yeah.
It seems like they were building a very strong case. What did the defense do to counter these arguments? What was their strategy?
So the defense really stuck to the self-defense narrative,
Okay.
trying to paint Ezra as the victim
Okay.
who had to protect herself from this abusive ex-boyfriend.
All right.
They emphasized her initial claim of being attacked,
Okay.
and they pointed to her injuries as proof of Alex's aggression.
Right.
And they tried to explain away any inconsistencies by saying that it was because of the trauma
Okay.
and the chaotic nature of the struggle.
It sounds like a very classic he said, she said type of situation, but with this added layer of forensic evidence and these conflicting testimonies.
Exactly.
So how did the jury interpret all of this?
Well, after hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing all the evidence, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours.
Wow.
Before returning a guilty verdict.
A quick verdict like that really suggests that they found the prosecution's case pretty convincing. What was Ezra's sentence?
Ezra McCandless was sentenced to life in prison.
Wow.
With the possibility of parole after 50 years.
This case really brings up that important concept of burden of proof.
Yeah.
You know, in a criminal trial, the prosecution has to prove the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right. And it sounds like they were able to do that in this case.
Yeah, they presented a very cohesive narrative that was backed up by evidence expert testimony.
Yeah.
And those inconsistencies in Ezra's own account.
Yeah.
You know, the defense just really struggled to provide a plausible alternative explanation.
Yeah. So legally, the case is closed, but it still leaves us with a lot to think about.
Absolutely.
Emotionally, ethically.
Yeah.
What are some of the bigger implications of this case?
Well, this case highlights just how complex these self-defense claims can be.
Okay.
And the potential for manipulation in relationships. It also raises questions about how we view victims and perpetrators.
Right.
Especially when you bring in gender dynamics and those media narratives.
That's a really good point. It's so important to approach cases like this with a critical eye.
Yeah.
To consider all sides and all the evidence.
Absolutely.
Before we make up our minds.
Right.
We need to be aware of our own biases and avoid jumping to conclusions.
Just based on like incomplete information or those sensationalized narratives.
Exactly. This case should really serve as a cautionary tale.
Okay.
About the dangers of obsession.
Yeah.
And just the devastating consequences that can happen when personal desires completely override ethical boundaries.
It also reminds us about the lasting impact these crimes have on the victim's loved ones.
Absolutely.
You know, while the legal system may provide some sense of justice, it can never erase the pain and loss that the people left behind experience.
You know, in the midst of all the legal arguments and the media attention, it's important to remember that a young life was cut short here.
Right.
And Alex Woodworth's family and friends are left to deal with this senseless death.
Absolutely.
And it's a burden that they're going to carry for a very long time.
So we've really gone deep into this Ezra McCandless case, you know. We've looked at the crime itself, the trial, the verdict, and there are just so many questions that linger. What do you think is like the most thought-provoking part of all of this?
You know, for me, it's just the unsettling realization that people who seem totally ordinary can be capable of such incredible violence.
Right.
This case, you know, took place in this quiet rural community.
Yeah.
It's like a place where you just wouldn't expect this brutal crime to happen.
Yeah.
It makes you question, you know, like where danger really is. And it reminds us that darkness can exist anywhere.
It is a chilling thought. It makes you wonder how well you can really know the people around you
Yeah.
and what they're truly capable of. And, this case also brings up our responsibility as bystanders.
Right.
Jason, for example, he had this feeling something wasn't right between Ezra and Alex.
Yeah.
He even called the police, but in the end, it wasn't enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Jason's actions, I think, really highlight that tough balance between respecting people's privacy and, taking action when you think someone's in danger.
Right.
There's no easy answer. But this case, I think, encourages us to trust our gut.
Okay.
And to say something when we see those red flags.
Yeah.
Even if it feels uncomfortable or like you're overstepping.
Right.
It's about understanding that even small actions can sometimes have a huge impact.
Absolutely. We need to shift from a mindset of, it's not my business,
Right.
to a mindset of, I care about the people around me and I want to make sure they're safe.
Exactly.
This case also really highlights the whole idea of manipulation, especially in relationships. I mean, Ezra's behavior throughout this whole thing showed a pattern of deception and this need to control the narrative.
Right, and it's important to recognize that manipulation can be really subtle.
Yeah.
It can be disguised as concern or helplessness,
Mm-hmm.
or it can be much more overt with threats and intimidation.
So how do we know?
Well, the key is to learn those signs.
Okay.
And to get help if you think you're being manipulated.
Right.
Or if you see someone else who might be in an abusive situation. There are a lot of resources out there.
Okay.
Like hotlines and support groups that can help.
This deep dive has taken us through a whole roller coaster of emotions.
Yeah.
Shock, disbelief, anger, sadness.
Right.
But it also reminds us how important critical thinking is.
Absolutely.
Empathy and the pursuit of justice. We need to understand human behavior.
Yeah.
The power of manipulation and the impact violence has on everyone.
It's a lot to process.
It really is. So as we wrap up our exploration of the Ezra McCandless case, what are your final thoughts?
Well, I'd like to leave everyone with this.
Yeah.
How can we as individuals and as a society encourage healthier relationships? How can we promote open communication?
Yeah.
And create environments where everyone feels safe and supported?
Those are really important questions, and it all starts with us.
It really does.
Thank you for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We hope this deep dive has encouraged you to think critically, question what you hear, and have these important conversations. Because knowledge is power.
Right.
The more we understand about human behavior and what causes violence, the better chance we have of creating a safer world.
I completely agree.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.